Hey, now, before we all headed off for our summer break, Australians all seemed rather unified in one thing, that the government wasn't that amazing. In fact, opinion polls had shown that up to 80% of Australians believed that the government was not doing enough when it came to the cost of living. When it came to the number of people that had been let into the country in a full year of the Albanese government, well, you take your pick. All voters, Labor voters, coalition voters and anyone else all believed that the immigration levels were too high. 59% according to the Resolve poll in overall support. And that all-important swing factor of other voters being minor parties and independents, well, the number even higher. And then, of course, there was the Prime Minister still licking his wounds from spending $450 million of your money, not on fixing the streets of Alice Springs, but instead Alice Springs, among other places, voting against his idea to bring a committee to Canberra and change the Constitution, to get his moment in history. Well, as you know, there were many in the media who, to use the American term, were rooting for, to use the Australianism, were cheering for, a change in fortunes of the bloke who they hoped would be Prime Minister for multiple elections, and that the guy that they like politically, as well as gives them better access to power and to information, despite the fact that so often he runs an opaque, no questions asked, sign this non-disclosure agreement, redact the documents kind of government. The expectation was that he would be able to fix things over summer, that everything would get a reset. He was throwing out the playbook that hadn't worked in 2023, a playbook that, by the way, included a tax rise on 10 million people where $1,500 was automatically taken away as a tax deduction. And part of that process was to announce that there would be a reduction in the number of people that would be coming into the country. The migration numbers, that were the best part of 750,000, well, we wouldn't be going there again in 2024. Clueless Claire O'Neill, the immigration minister, they were all there giggling and smiling. But then the first month of this year, reality started to take over the spin. As we told you, the highest numbers since 2009 were coming into the country. That's the reality of what was taking place. The Prime Minister also made his changes when it came to tax cuts. The polls said that this was a masterstroke when it came to politics because, of course, everyone was being told you'd be getting thousands and thousands of dollars. And tax cuts for everyone, asterisks, not really everyone.
Whether they be low-income earners or middle-income earners, or indeed even high-income earners who'll get a $4,500 tax cut.
And of course, all of this culminated in the winning of the Dunkley by-election, a by-election that, yes, the Libs at one point, according to one poll, were a good chance of winning, but the expectation was that they'd be able to take a big chunk out of the government. They took a chunk out of the government, but not a particularly big one, so therefore the reset worked, according to the media.
Labor has won the Dunkley by-election, justifying the Prime Minister's changes to tax cuts.
Now, with wages rising faster than inflation, with a tax cut on the way, a budget in May and potential interest rate cuts likely, there is a feeling among the government that things will get easier for Australian households, and that will mean elections get easier for the government.
But a couple of weeks into April, and the reality is basically there is no change from where the government was at the end of last year. The thousands of dollars in tax cuts are now being seen as too little too late, exactly what we've said the whole way through. When the reality is, if you earn under $45,000, it's virtually nothing. If you are at $45,000 and therefore the one in most need of help with cost of living, it's $15 a week. That's not enough for takeaway for a family of four, let alone all the way up to the big end of town on $100,000, which of course is pretty average in places like Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. They get $120 a month. The cost of living pressures that supposedly we had all worked our way through because of the genius of this government and all of their policies. Well, again, the Finder cost of living pressure gauge, as they call it, is still sitting in extreme, way higher than it was a couple of years ago, and basically where it was for the majority of 2023, a year when Australians believed the government wasn't doing enough. And when it came to those busy streets that we were being promised, well, they were going to change. Well, as I said, the first month of this year rolls around and guess what? Even more people than ever before. In fact, more than since 2009 were coming into the country. More than 125,000 people in 1 month. So all the spin that everything was okay, the reality is that things have gotten worse. And the solution to the political bushfire, at best, was a bucket of water for each and every Australian. Well, of course, that's not going to put out a bushfire. But the Prime Minister says, don't worry, I'm sweet, I'm all good, I'm still the one that Australians love.
We haven't lost, to go back to Nemesis, we haven't lost a news poll since I've been Prime Minister.
Factually correct. They have not fallen below 50% in news poll. But news poll, which of course has been enough to change Prime Ministers on both sides of the political divide in the most recent political generation, it shows that his government is not headed to be returned with a majority. Instead, the government that only just got over the line, thanks to Greens' preferences, would lose at least 4 seats at the next election, and according to news poll, their 76 that would be required means they have to go cap in hand with at least 3 seats to be able to form a government. Now, most likely there are some reasonable members of the crossbench that will get them there, but if that number goes any lower, and it will go lower between now and the election, then it's going to be more crossbenchers, eventually getting to the Greens. And as for the Prime Minister's personal standings, again, I just wanted to take this little temperature as we move towards the budget in May, but as we're going through the spin cycle that I talked about last night in the lead up to the budget. The Prime Minister's personal numbers in other polls are not great either. In the Reserve poll, you can see there that 49% of Australians say that he is doing a poor or very poor job, compared to just 38% who say that he's keeping it positive. For the past 9 months in a row, including this month, in the Turnbull Times, in The Guardian, in their opinion poll, the country is headed in the wrong direction. 49% of people say that we're headed in the wrong track. And then all of those people who are paid to talk about politics on the 6 p.m. news all day long, on the radio, telly, writing articles all over the newspapers, they should have followed this story today, but of course they had no interest because it starts to, well, break the narrative of a Prime Minister who has found his second wind. But in actual fact, he's starting to, well, gas out. The Morgan poll came out today and showed that if an election was held last weekend, the Liberal Party would win. And I mean win. A two-party preferred election. After preferences, after everything else. And that's because the Labor Party's primary vote is a disgraceful 29.5%. Now, that is the lowest level that has been recorded for the Labor Party at the federal level in a very, very long time. It is dramatically lower than its lowest result in 100 years. Now, people who understand politics will say one poll does not create a trend, and it's the Morgan poll that often bounces around. But what it also shows us here, apart from the fact that the coalition is close to 40%, and if they can get above 40%, their chance of winning an election is pretty good. But the biggest number in change in this poll is One Nation. This is the third poll from a third pollster that is showing that One Nation's numbers are up by a couple of percent around the country. Now, this means that if there is what is called preference discipline, if, say, 2/3 of people who plan to vote One Nation at this federal election move their preferences away from the Labor Party, we could be in for a 2019 result. If it still ends up at about 50-50, when it comes to preferences and everyone's a bugger and nobody you're going to back in, well, then most likely the Labor Party squeaks over just. But this was a big poll today, a big poll that showed a big change in the electorate. It didn't necessarily show a giant jump in support for the Liberal Party, although that is getting stronger. It certainly showed things getting worse for Labor. This is on top of the Guardian poll. And as I said, it tells you about half the country thinks we're headed in the wrong direction. More than, or about, again, half of the country who believes the Prime Minister's doing a very poor job. The bloke hasn't bounced back at all. It's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And all of them are of his own making. All of them are his own decisions. Because, you see, while he thinks that there are grand political solutions, and as our colleague Sharry Markson and my friend told you, that when those tax cut changes were being made, Labor MPs were being told to go back to their communities and say this was the quote-unquote solution to cost of living. $15 a week does not solve anything. Even $120 a month does not solve anything. It gives a government a capacity to say they're doing something, but when it's not actually going to move the needle, well, then the fire is just as bad as it was last year. The only difference is that you've got a politician and largely the media trying to pretend nothing's happening.
All right, move on. Nothing to see here. Please disperse. Nothing to see here.
although Frank Drebin was likeable. Now, one other thing that constantly we hear from this Prime Minister and all of the people sent out to speak on his behalf, a echo that the media likes to push in their narrative, not news, is this from the PM.
A plan to address cost of living, take pressure off cost of living, pressure off the cost of living, cost of living relief, downward pressure on cost of living.
Well, as I said last night, we're going to go through this very boring month-long pantomime now of what is or isn't in the budget. But I wanted to bring you this tonight because despite the fact that they say they're going to do everything they possibly can to deal with cost of living, old mate Grim Jim Chalmers was out there telling anyone who listened today, if you are somebody who is at the lower end of the income spectrum, there's nothing more than the dribble of too little too late when it comes to the tax cuts. In fact, welfare recipients who will not directly benefit from the revamped Stage 3 tax cuts can expect only minor cost of living support at next month's federal budget, as the government strives for a second successive surplus to bolster its electoral prospects, pay down debt and put inflation to the sword. Now, they're going for their electoral prospects. Now, under the intergenerational report that Jim Chalmers released last year, we are set for budget deficits for the next 40 years. As I explained in great detail last night, our problem is we don't cut spending and we don't increase revenue, so we stay in this position where as the distance between the money coming in versus the money going out gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the deficits just keep getting added. And the government then pretended that $1 trillion was the bill that was left over. Apparently COVID had never happened. Apparently JobKeeper had never happened. The people who wanted us to buy Virgin Airlines with taxpayer money, the reality is that they are now looking down the barrel of $1.4 trillion in government debt. These are the people who are doing everything it can when it comes to the cost of living. Well, again, here is Grim Jim today.
Overwhelmingly, the biggest part of that cost of living relief will be a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer.
But nothing else. But of course, as I have mentioned almost every night, and I have to because you've got to say it this many times to get it through their thick skulls. You get it, but we've got to get it through their thick skulls, right? We've got to get it through them that they are in a position to make decisions to make things cost more. There's this thing called indexation, which means that petrol, alcohol and a whole bunch of other taxes, well, they increase every few months. In fact, they end up chasing inflation. Billions of dollars. They are in a position in this federal budget, if they want to give people back $1,500 as an automatic tax return, regardless of how much money that you earn. That would help people under $45,000. A reduction in the amount of petrol tax would help people under the $45,000. No further increases to things like alcohol would mean that local businesses that don't just sell it, but those who also bottle it, brew it, make it, that they too would not end up in a world of trouble. But this is a government that is not interested in actually doing anything about cost of living. It's all about performance. It's all about a form of performance art, rather than actually taking the hit to their own political fortunes of being able to say that they have had yet another budget surplus. But this is a budget surplus that is built on mining that they hate and petrol taxes that they could control. Wait, watch and see, because I'll forget a lot of the other spin, but they have told us for how long we care about cost of living. They could do it tomorrow. What about that $1,500? That'd cost about $3 billion, but no, there's no way they're going to do that, are they? Because then they'd have to admit that they were wrong to take it away. So what we end up now is in a scenario where any and every industry becomes the scapegoat for the government, that the government pretends that they have no control, no capacity to be able to change the things that will change your life, despite the fact that something as simple yet, in my opinion, as profound as petrol tax is a decision that they could make tomorrow, but they choose not to. So instead what we have is, of course, the great sport of bank bashing now being appropriated to other industries. Industries that employ a lot of people, that pay an awful lot of tax. Now, we've seen this play before. Because when interest rates went up in May of 2022, it was all one person's fault.
We think that the difference between Labor and the government is the government's trying to wash their hands of this challenge. You know, they don't understand the pressure that people are under Scott Morrison's cost of living crisis, and we do. And there are things that governments need to be focused on. Growing the economy